Today on the Word Preacher Podcast, High Councils in the Church, Defending Zion, and Zion's Camp. I'm Brett Jensen, and this is the Word Preacher Podcast. All right, our Come Follow Me material for this coming week will bring us to sections 102 through 105. Let's go ahead and get started talking about the High Council. Here's some reading from section 102. The accused, in all cases, has a right to 1/2 of the council to prevent insult or injustice, and the counselors appointed to speak before the council are to present the case after the evidence is examined in its true light before the council, and every man is to speak according to equity and justice. Those counselors who draw even numbers, that is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12, are the individuals who are to stand up in behalf of the accused and prevent insult or injustice. And in all cases, the accuser and the accused shall have a privilege of speaking for themselves before the council, after the evidences are heard and the counselors who are appointed to speak on the case have finished their remarks. After the evidences are heard, the counselors, accuser and accused, have spoken. The president shall give a decision according to the understanding which he shall have of the case, and call upon the 12 counselors to sanction the same by their vote. But should the remaining counselors who have not spoken, or any one of them, after hearing the evidence and pleadings impartially, discover an error in the decision of the president, they can manifest it, and the case shall have a rehearing. And if, after a careful rehearing, any additional light is shown upon the case, the decision shall be altered accordingly. But in case no additional light is given, the first decision shall stand, the majority of the council having power to determine the same. Okay, so here we have a description of the proceedings of kind of like a membership council, or the way that the High Council would make judgments in the church. Now, this isn't a new idea. Even in the days of Moses, people came to ecclesiastical authorities to judge matters that were important in their lives. In fact, it was Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, who famously counseled Moses to delegate to other just men the responsibilities of helping people navigate their disputes. Now, membership councils are not enforcers or interpreters of government law. So maybe instead of Moses, who had both government and religious roles, a good example can be found in the Book of Mormon, where you see those responsibilities divided between Alma the high priest and King Mosiah. And King Mosiah handled the judgments of law, but Alma the high priest handled moral and religious judgments. And this is a little more along the lines of what you'd see in the High Council today. Moral and religious judgment being provided. So the purpose of a religious judgment from the beginning, they've always included 3 important principles: the protection of victims from genuine harm, the accuser, also to save the soul of the accused, assisting in the repentance process, and also to protect from false accusations, and then also to protect the integrity of the church. Now, in the pattern that we read about there in the Doctrine and Covenants, you can see how these purposes blend with the high councils of the church. Accusers are given the right to speak and present evidence of harmful acts by a member of the church. The accused is protected from insult, and efforts are made to defend against false accusations. judgments made with equity and carefully considering all the evidence. And the council, in considering all of this, ensures that the interests of all parties are handled in a respectful manner, even allowing appeals and reviews to ensure that the correct decisions are made. The integrity of the church is not maintained by covering up misconduct. Now, there is an expectation of confidentiality, but this is blended with appropriate actions. For example, a church leader may typically hold council proceedings in confidence, but may be obligated to disclose to legal authorities if he discovers a crime such as child abuse. That would be something that they would disclose to legal authorities under the instructions of the church leadership. Now, a membership council in the church is not capable of inflicting fines or imprisonment or any other kind of criminal punishment. The only restrictions that the church has the power to make are to either restrict or withdraw membership. That's it. But in doing these things, the goal is always, as we mentioned before, to protect people from harm, to save the soul of the person who is guilty of a crime, and to protect the integrity of the church. All right. The next portion that I'd like to cover is talking about defending Zion. Let's do some reading from section 103. This is the first 8 verses. Verily I say unto you, my friends, behold, I will give unto you a revelation and commandment, that you may know how to act in the discharge of your duties concerning the salvation and redemption of your brethren, who have been scattered on the land of Zion, being driven and smitten by the hands of mine enemies, on whom I will pour out my wrath without measure in mine own time. For I have suffered them thus far, that they might fill up the measure of their iniquities, that their cup might be full, and that those who call themselves after my name might be chastened for a little season with a sore and grievous chastisement, because they did not hearken altogether unto the precepts and commandments which I gave unto them. But verily I say unto you that I have decreed a decree which my people shall realize, inasmuch as they hearken from this very hour unto the counsel which I, the Lord their God, shall give unto them. For behold, they shall, for I have decreed it, begin to prevail against mine enemies from this very hour. And by hearkening to observe all the words which I, the Lord their God, shall speak unto them, they shall never cease to prevail, until the kingdoms of the world are subdued under my feet, and the earth is given unto the saints to possess it forever and ever. But inasmuch as they keep not my commandments, and hearken not to observe all my words, the kingdoms of the world shall prevail against them. So in those verses, we have some important information here. And a little bit of context, I think, would be helpful. Western Missouri in the early 1800s was a frontier. This was not established civilized cities that were built there. Some of the people were kind of rough trappers. They didn't really care about manners. Some of the people that were maybe a little more civilized had come from southern roots. They had strong opinions about slavery, and they were suspicious of a strange culture of religious individuals from the north who seemed to believe that God had given them this land. Now, in context, it is important to point out, this sentiment was not unique to Missouri. In fact, men of the South in these decades grew angry over many attempts by Northerners to assert themselves on their culture and ways, and fought in a terrible civil war over these fears. It's worth noting that, well, some of their culture and ways were absolutely garbage. Some of the fears that they had about the Northerners were absolutely justified, that Northerners absolutely imposed their will on people of the South by exploiting them. Now, obviously, that does not justify any of the atrocities committed by the people of Missouri. But it does provide a little context for understanding that alone, the saints had absolutely no chance to build Zion. There were a few hundred people, and they were trying to compete with a large force of very passionate individuals. They were not going to do it themselves. It required divine intervention. And divine intervention requires a people with sufficient faith. Now, while there were many faithful people, many good people, people we would say are role models, superior to the faith of modern saints in many ways, the faith of these saints was not sufficient to build what God wanted them to build. And this is why we see in these verses the Lord speaking about hearkening to his counsel and being chastened for not keeping his commandments. Absent divine intervention, what could the saints do? Well, they were just stuck relying on themselves, or metaphorically turning to Egypt for help. They went to the governor, who was reluctant to get involved. And he wasn't going to protect the saints, even if they managed to get back to their homes in Jackson County. This is an important message, an important lesson. Turning to Egypt will not save you. Egypt will fail you, just as the Egyptians failed to protect Jehoiakim and Zedekiah from Babylon. Turning to Egypt or modern political powers is not the way to save you. The only reliable source of help is divine intervention. There are important parallels to modern times here in addition to that. Like when we think about how we qualify for divine intervention, the faith among members of the church needs to increase. It must be stronger. Too many of our own people invest in Babylonian cottages rather than devoting themselves to building Zion. Too few are engaged as they ought to be in, as the Lord put it, the discharge of their duties. Defending Zion always requires, first and foremost, following the Lord. And if your home is not in order, you can best defend Zion by repenting. If you prioritize political, social, or any other agenda above your relationship with God, you have an opportunity right now to make an adjustment. Now that can be hard because sometimes the apostles will say things that will make you feel uncomfortable. Sometimes we're asked to do things that are uncomfortable, whether that means settling in a wild frontier or giving up a show or a movie or a musician or an association that interferes with our spiritual development. Adequate faith is what will help us follow Jesus better. And we know the sources that will help us seek that faith. They come and are found in his church. All right, let's talk about Zion's camp. Because the problems in the church were not limited to just Missouri. They extended up to Ohio as well. Here are some verses that I would like to read. It is my will that my servant Parley P. Pratt and my servant Lyman White should not return to the land of their brethren until they have obtained companies to go up unto the land of Zion by tens or by twenties or by fifties or by 100, until they have obtained to the number of 500 of the strength of my house. Behold, this is my will. Ask, and ye shall receive. But men do not always do my will. Therefore, if you cannot obtain 500, seek diligently that peradventure you may obtain 300. And if you cannot obtain 300, seek diligently that peradventure ye may obtain 100. But verily I say unto you, a commandment I give unto you, that ye shall not go up unto the land of Zion until you have obtained 100 of the strength of my house to go up with you unto the land of Zion. Therefore, as I said unto you, ask, and ye shall receive. Pray earnestly that peradventure my servant Joseph Smith Jr. may go with you and preside in the midst of my people and organize my kingdom upon the consecrated land and establish the children of Zion upon the laws and commandments which have been and which shall be given unto you. All victory and glory is brought to pass through your diligence, faithfulness, and prayers of faith. So that's verses 30 through 36 in section 103. So the Lord expresses a vision. His vision includes a force of 500 men of the strength of the Lord's house. Now the group that became known as Zion's camp consisted of a few more than 200 men, accompanied by about 12 women and 10 children. Not even half of what the Lord envisioned. It was almost as though the Lord knew that this would happen when he said, behold, this is my will, ask and ye shall receive, but men do not always do my will. That having been said, a little show of faith did produce a great miracle. Now, after Zion's camp had received word that they would not be helped by Governor Dunklin, Zion's camp headed towards Clay County, Missouri. That's where the displaced saints were occupying. And they were threatened on their journey by messengers that night 400 men would attack their camp. However, a huge storm dropped tremendous hailstones and caused the nearby fishing river to rise nearly 40 feet, which protected the camp from this mob. It was a miracle. They were saved by God. All right, now that having said, let's do a little more reading and talk about some of the consequences of the camp. For behold, I have prepared a great endowment and blessing to be poured out upon them, inasmuch as they are faithful and continue in humility before me. Therefore it is expedient in me that mine elders should wait for a little season for the redemption of Zion. For behold, I do not require at their hands to fight the battles of Zion. For as I said in a former commandment, even so will I fulfill. I will fight your battles. Behold, the destroyer I have sent forth to destroy and lay waste mine enemies, and not many years hence. They shall not be left to pollute mine heritage, and to blaspheme my name upon the lands which I have consecrated for the gathering together of my saints. Behold, I have commanded my servant Joseph Smith Jr. to say unto the strength of my house, even my warriors, my young men and middle-aged, to gather together for the redemption of my people, and throw down the towers of mine enemies, and scatter their watchmen. But the strength of my house have not hearkened unto my words. But inasmuch as there are those who have hearkened unto my words, I've prepared a blessing and an endowment for them, if they continue faithful. I have heard their prayers and will accept their offering, and it is expedient in me that they should be brought thus far for a trial of their faith. Okay, so after marching so far, the men of Zion's camp learned that they would not be fighting. The Lord would fight the battles for Zion. They would not be a combat force. Now, we can see that part of this is because the strength of his house did not hearken unto his words. But he also gives this silver lining. Those who did hearken would receive power and blessings for their obedience. Some men hearkened to this counsel, but some felt betrayed and even apostatized from the church after coming on this march. This is an important principle as well. God almost never sends his prophets to tell people things that are popular. Sometimes people feel that the church seems to be lining up with their political views and be along the same lines as things that they feel strongly socially about. And then the church may say something, or a leader of the church may say something that seems opposed to it. Now, in that situation, people who alienate or ally themselves with the church only when it seems to line up with their goals, they're not going to last, because the principles that prophets are called of God and that God's purposes are more complex than we might initially understand, these principles are fundamental. Much of the leadership of the church for the next decades came from the faithful in Zion's camp, not only who had the courage to march to defend Zion, but the faith to follow Joseph when the Lord revealed that they would not fight. In the end, God's priorities are not always going to line up with yours. Humble yourself now so that it will be easier to adjust your priorities when the time comes. Defending Zion is vital to the Lord. It begins with you individually repenting and becoming pure in heart. The Lord's counsels and organization are prepared to help protect saints and sinners and his church in the great work of building Zion. We appreciate all the support for the Word Preacher podcast. Next week, we will be looking at sections 106 through 108, discussing priesthood leadership in the Church of Jesus Christ. Now, there's a ton of stuff we did not cover in today's podcast. Please study that individually and with your family. And as always, fight on.